Behind me in this square, they chained a 12-year-old boy to a hitching post for 3 January days in 1889. His crime was taking a single apple. His name was Isaiah Blackwater.
The Kentucky Bloodbath of 1889. Granny Blackwater slaughtered 22 lawmen, who chained her grandson like a dog in the town square. The most terrifying campaign of vengeance in Kentucky mountain history, and the most devastating demonstration that age and appearance mean nothing when the fury of a grandmother is awakened. When an elderly woman who had spent her life healing the sick turned her knowledge to darker purposes and eliminated every man responsible for the public humiliation and torture of her grandson. This is the true story of Granny Blackwater. Our story begins in the rugged mountain section of Breathitt County, Kentucky, known throughout the region as Bloody Breathitt for the feuds and violence that had marked its history since the first settlers arrived. The mountains rise here in great folds of sandstone and shale, their hollows sheltering families who had lived by their own laws since before Kentucky was a state, who answered insults with violence, and who remembered wrongs across generations. The people who settled these hollows came seeking freedom from interference, and their descendants maintained that spirit through decades of conflict that made the county's reputation for bloodshed well-earned. You see, in Breathitt County, during the years of our story, the law was not a neutral force that protected the innocent and punished the guilty, but was a weapon wielded by those who had the money and connections to control it. The county's officials were not elected by the people they governed, but were appointed by political machines that served the interests of the wealthy and the powerful. The sheriffs and deputies and constables who enforced the law did so selectively, protecting those who paid them and persecuting those who opposed them, using their badges as licenses to commit the very crimes they were supposed to prevent. The woman at the center of our story was known throughout the Kentucky mountains simply as Granny Blackwater, though her given name was Eliza Jane Blackwater, and she had been born Eliza Jane Combs in a cabin on the upper reaches of the Middle Fork of the Kentucky River, 73 years before the events that would make her name a legend. She had married Ezekiel Blackwater when she was 16, had borne him 11 children of whom 7 survived to adulthood, had buried him 30 years before our story begins, and had spent the decade since his death becoming the most respected healer in the Kentucky mountains. That's right, Granny Blackwater was known from one end of Breathitt County to the other as a woman whose knowledge of herbs and roots and the healing arts had no equal in the region. She had learned the craft from her own grandmother, who had learned it from hers, a chain of knowledge that stretched back to the old country and that had been refined by generations of practice in the mountains of Kentucky. People came to her cabin from miles around, seeking remedies for ailments that the doctors in town could not cure, trusting her wisdom in matters of birth and death and everything between. Her knowledge extended beyond the herbs that healed to the plants that killed, a darker expertise that she had never employed, but that she understood with the same thoroughness that characterized all her learning. She knew which mushrooms would stop a heart, which roots would paralyze the muscles that controlled breathing, which berries would produce symptoms that mimicked natural illness, which combinations would leave no trace that any physician could detect. This knowledge was part of the healer's art, essential to avoiding the accidental administration of substances that could harm rather than help, but it was also knowledge that could be turned to other purposes when circumstances demanded. Granny Blackwater stood barely 5 feet tall, her body bent by decades of labor and the natural processes of aging, her hair white as mountain snow, her face a map of wrinkles that recorded 73 years of Kentucky weather and Kentucky sorrow. She moved slowly, supported by a cane that she had carved herself from a hickory branch, her steps careful and deliberate, in ways that made observers assume she posed no threat to anyone. This assumption would prove to be catastrophically wrong. Her household consisted of herself and her grandson, a boy named Thomas, who was the son of her youngest daughter Mary, who had died giving birth to him 17 years before our story begins. Thomas had been raised by his grandmother since infancy, had never known any other parent, had grown up in her cabin learning the healing arts alongside the farming and hunting that mountain life required. He was a good boy by every account, respectful to his elders and kind to those weaker than himself, a young man whose future seemed bright despite the poverty of his circumstances. Thomas Blackwater was 17 years old at the time of the events that would transform his grandmother from healer to avenger. He was tall for his age, having inherited his father's height rather than the Blackwater shortness, with dark hair and eyes that observers described as gentle, lacking the hardness that characterized many young men in Bloody Breathitt. He helped his grandmother with her healing work, gathering herbs in the forest and preparing remedies according to her instructions, serving as her eyes and hands as her own vision and dexterity declined with age. The conflict that would lead to tragedy began not with Thomas, but with his grandmother's refusal to provide her healing services to a man she believed unworthy of them. Vernon Crawford was the county's political boss, a man whose wealth derived from land speculation, and whose power derived from his ability to control the officials who were supposed to serve the public interest. Crawford had come to Granny Blackwater seeking treatment for a condition that his regular physicians had been unable to cure, had offered money that would have represented a year's income for most families in the county, and had been refused. Granny Blackwater's refusal was based on her knowledge of what Crawford had done to the people of Breathitt County, the families he had cheated out of their land, the men he had arrested on false charges, the women he had left destitute when their husbands died, in circumstances that always seemed to benefit Crawford's interests. She told him that her healing was not for sale to men whose lives were devoted to causing harm, that the gifts she had received from her grandmother were meant to serve those who deserved healing, that he could take his money and his diseases and leave her cabin and never return. Crawford was not accustomed to refusal, and he was not prepared to accept it. He left Granny Blackwater's cabin with a fury that observers recognized as dangerous, with promises of consequences that the old woman seemed to regard with indifference. She had lived too long to fear men like Crawford, had seen too much of life to be intimidated by threats from those who mistook power for worth. She returned to her work, treating the sick who came to her door, apparently unconcerned about the enemy she had made. The retaliation came not against Granny Blackwater herself, but against her grandson, the boy she had raised from infancy, and who represented everything she had left in the world. Crawford understood that attacking an elderly healer directly would produce a backlash that even his power could not contain, that the community's respect for Granny Blackwater would make any obvious persecution of her politically costly. But her grandson was a different matter, a young man without his grandmother's reputation, vulnerable in ways that the old woman herself was not. The pretext for Thomas's arrest was manufactured with the crude efficiency that characterized Crawford's operations. A theft was reported from a store owned by one of Crawford's associates, goods supposedly taken by a young man matching Thomas's description, witnesses produced who would swear to having seen him commit the crime. The evidence was fabricated from beginning to end. The witnesses coached in their testimony, the entire proceeding designed not to establish guilt, but to provide legal cover for what Crawford intended to do. The arrest was carried out on the morning of August 15, 1889, by Sheriff Daniel Morgan and a force of 21 deputies who had been assembled specifically for the purpose. The size of the force was vastly disproportionate to the supposed crime, designed not for practical necessity, but to send a message about the power that Crawford could deploy against anyone who defied him. Thomas was taken from his grandmother's cabin while she watched, her protests ignored, her demands to know the charges dismissed with contempt. What followed was not a legal proceeding, but a public spectacle designed to humiliate both Thomas and his grandmother, to demonstrate to the entire community what happened to those who refused to serve Crawford's interests. Thomas was brought to the town square, where a crowd had been gathered to witness his punishment, where the apparatus of his humiliation had already been prepared. The chain that they used was a dog chain, thick iron links designed to restrain animals rather than human beings, attached to a collar that was locked around Thomas's neck with a padlock whose key was kept by the sheriff himself. The other end of the chain was attached to a post in the center of the square, the same post where livestock was sometimes tied on market days, the symbolism unmistakable to everyone who witnessed it. Thomas Blackwater, grandson of the most respected healer in the county, was being treated as an animal, chained like a dog in the public square where everyone could see. The collar was too tight, had been deliberately sized to cause discomfort. The iron pressing against Thomas's throat in ways that made breathing difficult and swallowing painful. The chain was too short, forcing him to remain close to the post, limiting his movement to a circle no more than 5 feet in diameter, preventing him from reaching any shade or shelter from the August sun that beat down on the square with merciless intensity. The humiliation did not end with the chaining. The deputies had been instructed to treat Thomas as they would treat a disobedient animal, to reinforce through their actions the message that the chain was meant to convey. They threw scraps of food at him rather than feeding him properly, forcing him to eat from the ground like the animal they were pretending he was. They forced him to lap water from a bowl placed on the ground, pushing his head down when he tried to drink with his hands, making him kneel on all fours while they laughed and the crowd watched. The degradations escalated as the hours passed, the deputies inventing new humiliations to inflict, their creativity and cruelty seemingly inexhaustible. They made Thomas bark like a dog, threatening to tighten the collar if he refused. They forced him to chase scraps they threw, crawling on hands and knees while the chain clanked against the cobblestones. They urinated near him, claiming they were marking territory as dogs do, the symbolism deliberate and unmistakable. The crowd that gathered to watch was divided in its response. Some laughed along with the deputies, either genuinely amused by the spectacle or afraid to show sympathy that might draw official attention to themselves. Others watched in silence, their faces showing the horror they dared not express, their presence a witness to an injustice they were powerless to prevent. Children were brought to watch, their parents explaining that this was what happened to those who defied authority, the lesson designed to instill obedience through fear. Thomas was kept chained in the square for 3 days, exposed to the August sun during the day and the chill of mountain nights, denied proper food and water, subjected to continuous humiliation that was designed to break his spirit and to demonstrate his grandmother's powerlessness to protect him. The deputies worked in shifts, ensuring that someone was always present to enforce the degradation, to prevent anyone from helping the boy, to document through their constant presence that this punishment had the full authority of the law. Granny Blackwater came to the square each day, stood at the edge of the crowd watching what was being done to her grandson, her face showing an expression that witnesses would later describe as terrifying in its stillness. She did not weep, did not plead, did not give any outward sign of the fury that was building inside her. She simply watched, her eyes moving from Thomas to the deputies who tormented him, memorizing faces that she would later have reason to remember. On the 3rd day, Thomas was released. The charges against him dropped without explanation, the entire proceeding revealed as the persecution it had always been. He was carried home by neighbors who had watched his ordeal and who now tried to provide the care that the authorities had denied him. His body was covered with bruises from the blows the deputies had administered, his neck rubbed raw by the chain that had held him, his spirit damaged in ways that the physical injuries only partially revealed. Granny Blackwater received her grandson without words, tended to his wounds with the skill that decades of healing had provided, put him to bed in the cabin where she had raised him, and then sat in her rocking chair and began to plan. The campaign that followed would claim the lives of Sheriff Morgan and every one of the 21 deputies who had participated in Thomas's humiliation would unfold over the course of 18 months with a patience that reflected both Granny Blackwater's age and her determination, would demonstrate that an elderly woman with the right knowledge could be as deadly as any army of young men with guns. The planning process began immediately after Thomas was released, though to outside observers, Granny Blackwater appeared to be focused entirely on her grandson's recovery. She tended to his physical wounds with the skill that decades of practice had provided, applied salves to the raw skin where the collar had rubbed, treated the bruises that covered his body, ensured that the dehydration from 3 days without adequate water was properly addressed. But her mind was elsewhere, cataloguing the faces she had memorized, planning the methods she would employ, calculating the timing that would make her campaign successful. Her first task was to compile a complete list of every man who had participated in Thomas's humiliation. She questioned neighbors who had witnessed the event, asked seemingly innocent questions about who had been present and what they had done, built a roster that included not only the deputies who had administered the abuse, but the sheriff who had supervised it, and the political figures who had ordered it. The list eventually included 22 names, each one marked for death, each one unaware that an elderly healer had pronounced a sentence that no court would ever deliver. The method she chose reflected her expertise and her circumstances. She could not overpower men in their prime, could not engage in the kind of direct violence that younger avengers might have employed, but she could use the knowledge that a lifetime of healing had provided, could prepare substances that would kill without leaving traces that any physician could identify, could administer these substances in ways that made the deaths appear natural. The very skills that had made her valuable as a healer made her deadly as an avenger. Her knowledge of toxic plants was encyclopedic, accumulated through generations of teaching and decades of personal observation. She knew the monkshood that grew in shaded hollows, whose roots contained aconitine that could stop a heart within hours of ingestion. She knew the water hemlock that flourished near streams, whose roots were often mistaken for edible plants and whose toxins caused convulsions that led to death. She knew the foxglove whose leaves contained digitalis, which in proper doses treated heart conditions, but in excessive doses caused the heart to fail. She knew dozens of other plants whose properties could be adjusted to produce symptoms that would appear natural to any examining physician. The preparation of her weapons occupied the weeks between Thomas's release and the first killing. She gathered plants during her normal rounds of herb collection, dried and processed them in ways that concentrated their toxic properties, created tinctures and powders that could be added to food or drink without detection. Her workspace was her healing room, the same space where she prepared remedies that saved lives, the irony of using it to prepare substances that would take lives not lost on her, but not sufficient to deter her. The first death came 6 weeks after Thomas's release, time that Granny Blackwater had used to prepare her methods and to establish patterns that would deflect suspicion. The victim was one of the deputies who had been particularly cruel during Thomas's ordeal, a man named Dale Tackett, who had taken evident pleasure in the boy's humiliation. Tackett fell ill suddenly, displaying symptoms that the local physician attributed to a stomach ailment, dying within 3 days of the onset of symptoms in a manner that seemed entirely natural. The physician who examined Tackett's body found nothing remarkable, attributed the death to the kind of sudden illness that claimed lives in the mountains every year, signed the death certificate without suspicion. No one connected the death to Granny Blackwater, who had not been seen near Tackett in the days before his illness, who had no apparent means of administering any substance that might have caused his symptoms. She attended his funeral with the same solemn expression she wore to every funeral, offering condolences to his widow with apparent sincerity. The second death came a month later, claiming another deputy who had participated in Thomas's degradation. This man, Robert Lawson, died of what appeared to be heart failure, collapsing suddenly while working in his field, his body showing no signs of violence or poison. The physician who examined him concluded that the mountain life had simply proven too much for his heart, that the combination of hard labor and hard living had caught up with him as it caught up with so many men in the region. The third and fourth deaths followed the same pattern, deputies dying of causes that seemed natural, their deaths separated by intervals that prevented any pattern from becoming visible. The fifth death was attributed to a fever that swept through the man's household, the sixth to a fall that might have been caused by dizziness or weakness, the seventh to a sudden illness that no physician could explain but that no one thought to attribute to external causes. That's right. Granny Blackwater continued her campaign through the fall of 1889 and into the winter that followed, claiming victims with a regularity that reflected her patience and her skill. The 8th deputy died as the first snow fell, the 9th and 10th before Christmas, the 11th and 12th in the new year. Each death appeared natural, each victim seemingly claimed by the hazards of mountain life rather than by the deliberate action of a woman whom no one suspected was capable of such violence. The methods she employed varied according to circumstance and opportunity. Some victims received their doses through food prepared by wives who had no knowledge of what had been added to the ingredients they used. Granny Blackwater would visit these households on her healing rounds, would offer gifts of dried herbs or prepared remedies, would leave behind substances that the wives incorporated into meals without suspicion. The wives were innocent instruments of their husbands' deaths, their ignorance essential to the success of the method. Others consumed contaminated water from wells that Granny Blackwater had accessed during her rounds as a healer. She knew which families drew water from which sources, knew the schedules that determined when wells would be unattended, knew how to introduce substances that would disperse into the water and be consumed in doses too small to taste, but sufficient to accumulate over time. These deaths came more slowly than the others, the toxins building in the victims' bodies until they reached lethal concentrations, the gradual onset of symptoms making the eventual death seem even more natural. Still others received their poison directly from her hands, in remedies that they had sought for minor ailments and that contained additions their requests had not specified. A deputy complaining of a cough would receive a syrup that would suppress the cough while slowly damaging his heart. Another seeking treatment for a stomach complaint would receive a powder that would settle his stomach while introducing toxins that his liver could not process. The requests for treatment were genuine. The conditions she was asked to address were real. Only the remedies were false. The timing of her administrations was carefully calculated to prevent any pattern from emerging. She never killed 2 victims in the same week, never used the same method twice in succession, never acted in ways that might create connections between the deaths. Each victim died at a different interval from the last, each from apparently different causes, each in circumstances that seemed to have no relationship to what had happened to Thomas Blackwater, or to his grandmother's capacity for revenge. The community provided unwitting assistance in ways that reflected her position as the region's most trusted healer. Families invited her into their homes to treat illness, providing access that she used for purposes they could not imagine. Men who felt unwell sought her remedies, consuming substances that made their symptoms worse rather than better. The trust she had earned through decades of genuine healing now served as cover for actions that betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way possible. Sheriff Morgan began to suspect that something was wrong when the 13th deputy died, the accumulation of deaths finally reaching a threshold that seemed to exceed natural explanation. He conducted an informal investigation, examining the circumstances of each death, looking for connections that might explain why so many of his men were dying in such a short period. But he found nothing that pointed to any external cause, nothing that suggested the deaths were anything other than the tragic but natural losses that mountain communities routinely experienced. His investigation did note one common factor. All of the dead deputies had participated in Thomas Blackwater's punishment in the town square, but this connection seemed irrelevant to any explanation of how they might have died. An old woman could not have killed 13 healthy men through violence, and the idea that she might have poisoned them seemed impossible, given that most of the victims had no known contact with her in the period before their deaths. The sheriff's growing unease was visible to those who knew him well. He slept poorly, his dreams haunted by the faces of the men who had served under him and who were now in their graves. He ate little, his appetite destroyed by the fear that something he consumed might be the agent of his own death. He jumped at shadows, his nerves frayed by the knowledge that something was hunting his men and that he might be next. His deputies shared his fear, though none of them would speak of it openly. They gathered in groups rather than patrolling alone, sought safety in numbers that provided no real protection against an enemy they could not identify. Some began to carry talismans, charms against the evil that they believed was stalking them, religious symbols that their faith told them would provide protection that their badges could not. Others visited their own healers, seeking remedies against poisoning, swallowing preparations that would do nothing against the sophisticated methods Granny Blackwater employed. The atmosphere in the sheriff's office became one of barely suppressed terror. Men who had laughed while Thomas Blackwater lapped water from a bowl now found nothing amusing in the world around them. The arrogance that had characterized their treatment of the Blackwater family had been replaced by a fear that grew with each funeral they attended, each colleague they buried, each day that brought no explanation for what was happening to them. Morgan increased security around himself and his remaining deputies, warning them to be cautious without being able to specify what they should be cautious against. The warning had no effect. The 14th victim died in February, the 15th in March, the 16th and 17th in April. The deaths continued with the same regularity they had always shown, unaffected by the sheriff's attempts to prevent them. The 18th death came in May, 1 year after Thomas's humiliation. the timing deliberate, though no one but Granny Blackwater understood its significance. This victim was one of the deputies who had forced Thomas to lap water from a bowl like a dog, who had laughed while the boy knelt on all fours, performing the degradation that the chain around his neck symbolized. He died convulsing, his body racked by spasms that the physician attributed to some unknown toxin, but that he could not identify despite careful examination. The 19th and 20th deaths came in quick succession, leaving only Morgan and one remaining deputy alive from the original force of 22. The deputy fled the county, recognizing that remaining in Breathitt County was equivalent to a death sentence, seeking safety in a distant city where he hoped whoever was killing his colleagues could not reach him. His flight only postponed his fate. He died 3 months later in a boarding house 500 miles from the Kentucky mountains, his symptoms consistent with the same unknown illness that had claimed so many of his former colleagues. And then there was only Morgan himself, the sheriff who had arrested Thomas Blackwater, who had supervised his chaining in the town square, who had allowed the 3 days of humiliation to continue while the boy's grandmother watched. Morgan understood by now that he was the final target, that whatever force was claiming his deputies would eventually claim him as well. He took every precaution he could imagine, refused to eat anything he had not prepared himself, drank only water he had personally drawn from wells he trusted, surrounded himself with guards who watched for any threat. None of it mattered. Morgan died on August 15, 1890, exactly 1 year after Thomas Blackwater had been chained in the town square, the anniversary timing making clear to everyone what no investigation had been able to prove. He had been visiting his mother, an elderly woman who lived alone in a cabin outside town, had eaten dinner at her table as he had done countless times since childhood, had died within hours of leaving her home. The dish that killed him had been prepared by his mother using herbs that Granny Blackwater had provided, herbs that the old woman believed would help her with the joint pain that troubled her, but that contained additions she had not requested and could not have detected. The investigation into Morgan's death was more thorough than any that had preceded it, the circumstances too suspicious to be dismissed as coincidence. But the investigators found nothing that could prove Granny Blackwater's involvement, nothing that could explain how she had administered the poison, nothing that could support charges that any court would accept. The method was too sophisticated, the chain of causation too indirect, the evidence too thoroughly destroyed by the passage of time and the nature of the substances she had employed. Granny Blackwater was questioned, of course, her motive being obvious to everyone who knew the story of her grandson's humiliation. She received the investigators in her cabin with the same quiet dignity she had always shown, answered their questions with responses that revealed nothing, maintained her innocence with a conviction that they could not shake. She was an old woman, she reminded them, barely able to walk without assistance, possessed of no weapons and no strength that could have threatened men in their prime. The suggestion that she could have killed 22 deputies and a sheriff was absurd on its face. The case was never officially solved. The deaths attributed to various natural causes that the investigators knew were inadequate explanations, but that they could not disprove. The community knew the truth, of course, the same community that had watched Thomas's humiliation and that had provided the access that made Granny Blackwater's campaign possible. But the community would never speak, would never betray the woman who had avenged a wrong that the law itself had committed. Vernon Crawford, the man whose persecution of Granny Blackwater had started the entire chain of events, survived the campaign that he had provoked. The old woman had apparently decided that the lawmen who had carried out the humiliation were more culpable than the politician who had ordered it, or perhaps she had simply run out of time or energy before she could reach him. Crawford lived another 15 years, dying in 1905 of causes that appeared entirely natural, but that some in the community believed might have been otherwise. Thomas Blackwater recovered from his physical injuries but never entirely recovered from the psychological damage that his humiliation had inflicted. He remained with his grandmother for the rest of her life, caring for her as she aged and her own health declined, learning the healing arts that she had practiced and that he would continue after her death. He never married, never left the hollow where he had grown up, seemed to prefer a solitude that reflected the trauma he had experienced and that he never learned to fully escape. The damage that 3 days of public humiliation had inflicted on Thomas's psyche was visible to everyone who knew him. He flinched when strangers approached, his body remembering the blows that had accompanied his captivity. He avoided the town square where he had been chained, taking long detours to avoid passing through the space where his degradation had occurred. He could not bear to be touched on the neck, the memory of the collar that had held him too vivid to allow any contact with that part of his body. His relationship with his grandmother deepened in the years following his ordeal, the bond between them strengthened by shared trauma and shared secrets. Thomas never asked his grandmother what she had done, never sought confirmation of what he must have suspected, maintained a willful ignorance that allowed him to benefit from her vengeance without confronting its reality. She, for her part, never spoke of her campaign, never revealed the methods she had employed, never burdened her grandson with knowledge that might have complicated his relationship with her memory. The healing work that Thomas learned from his grandmother became his vocation and his refuge. He discovered that helping others provided a distraction from his own pain, that the focus required to practice the healer's art left no room for the memories that might otherwise have consumed him. He became skilled in his own right, not approaching his grandmother's mastery, but competent enough to serve the community that had witnessed his humiliation and that now sought his services with the same trust they had once placed in her. The community's treatment of Thomas after his ordeal reflected a collective guilt that no one would acknowledge directly. People went out of their way to show him kindness, to demonstrate through small gestures that they did not share the contempt that the deputies had expressed. They brought gifts to his grandmother's cabin, sought his services even when they might have traveled to see other healers, created a cocoon of support that could not undo the damage, but that at least demonstrated that he was valued. Granny Blackwater lived for another 12 years after her campaign was complete, dying in 1902 at the age of 86, her death coming as peacefully as the deaths she had inflicted on her victims had been violent. She was buried in the church cemetery beside her husband, her grave marked by a stone that bore only her name and her dates, the inscription giving no hint of the vengeance she had taken or the methods she had employed. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, many of whom had benefited from her healing over the decades, and all of whom understood what she had done and why. Thomas tended her grave for the rest of his life, visiting it weekly to clear the weeds and place fresh flowers, maintaining the connection to the woman who had raised him, and who had proven that her love for him was stronger than any force the law could deploy against him. He died in 1934 at the age of 62, having spent his entire adult life in the shadow of events that had occurred when he was 17, having become a healer himself, but never approaching the mastery that his grandmother had achieved. The legal aftermath of Granny Blackwater's campaign was minimal but significant. The deaths of an entire sheriff's department over the course of 18 months could not be entirely ignored, even if no perpetrator could be identified. State authorities investigated, produced reports that documented the deaths without explaining them, recommended reforms that were never implemented. The case became a reference point in discussions of law enforcement corruption, cited by those who argued that officials who abused their authority could expect consequences that the legal system would not provide. The reforms that followed the case addressed some of the abuses that had made Thomas's humiliation possible. Public punishment of the kind that he had experienced was prohibited. The chaining of prisoners for extended periods was banned. The treatment of accused persons was subjected to regulations that had not previously existed. These reforms came too late for Thomas, but may have prevented similar abuses from being inflicted on others. The songs that emerged from the Granny Blackwater story varied widely in their approach and message. Some celebrated her as a hero, an elderly woman who had proven that age and frailty were no barriers to justice when the cause was righteous and the determination was sufficient. Others focused on the horror of her methods, the betrayal of trust that her use of healing knowledge represented, the questions about the ethics of killing through poison rather than through more direct means. The most popular ballad began with a description of Granny Blackwater herself, painting a portrait of an old woman whose appearance suggested nothing of the capacity for violence that lay beneath her wrinkled surface. The melody was gentle at first, almost tender, the kind of tune that might accompany a lullaby or a hymn. The contrast between the gentle music and the violent content that was coming made the song particularly effective. The second verse described Thomas's arrest and his chaining in the town square, the humiliation that the deputies had inflicted, the 3 days of degradation that the entire community had witnessed. The melody shifted here, becoming minor and mournful, the notes carrying the weight of a wrong that demanded response. The third verse described Granny Blackwater watching from the edge of the crowd, her face showing the stillness that witnesses had found so terrifying, her eyes memorizing the faces of the men who were tormenting her grandson. This verse suggested the planning that was already beginning, the determination that was forming behind the impassive facade. The fourth verse described the campaign itself, the deaths coming one by one, the deputies falling to causes that no one could explain, the sheriff's growing terror as he realized that something was hunting his men. The melody became almost triumphant here, the rhythm quickening as the body count rose. The fifth verse described Morgan's death on the anniversary of Thomas's humiliation, the final victim falling to the woman whose power everyone had underestimated, the completion of the campaign that had claimed 22 lives. The melody resolved into something approaching satisfaction, the suggestion that justice had been done and that the story could finally end. The final verse described Granny Blackwater's remaining years, her peaceful death, her burial beside her husband, her legacy as both healer and avenger. The melody became tender again, returning to the gentle quality of the opening, suggesting that even those who kill can find peace when their killing is done. Musicians who performed this ballad reported that audiences responded with a complexity that reflected the moral ambiguity of the story. There was satisfaction at the punishment of men who had abused their authority, but there was also unease at the methods Granny Blackwater had employed, the betrayal of trust that her use of poison represented. The song did not try to resolve this ambiguity, but simply presented it, letting listeners draw their own conclusions. The melody itself became one of the most recognizable in the regional repertoire, its haunting quality making it instantly identifiable, even when played without words. The tune had a quality that musicians described as unsettling, minor keys, and unexpected progressions that created an atmosphere of menace beneath the surface gentleness. Listeners reported that the song stayed with them long after the performance ended, the melody recurring in their minds at unexpected moments. Another song focused specifically on Thomas, describing his ordeal in the town square and the trauma that followed, portraying him as the innocent victim whose suffering had provoked his grandmother's terrible response. This song was more mournful than the Granny Blackwater ballad, its melody suggesting the lasting damage that humiliation can inflict, the wounds that do not heal even when the physical injuries have faded. The Thomas ballad included a verse that described the collar being locked around his neck, the chain being attached to the post, the moment when a free young man became a chained animal in the public square. This verse was particularly painful to hear, its melody dropping into the lowest register of the singer's range, the notes themselves seeming to carry the weight of the iron that had bound him. Another verse described the 3 days of captivity, the sun and the cold, the scraps of food thrown at him, the water he was forced to lap from a bowl. Musicians who performed this section reported that audiences would sometimes look away, unable to meet the singer's eyes, the description of humiliation creating a vicarious shame that was almost unbearable to witness. A third song took the perspective of the deputies, imagining their growing terror as their colleagues died one by one, as they realized that something was hunting them but could not identify what it was. This song was the darkest of the three, its melody creating an atmosphere of dread that reflected the experience of men who knew they were marked for death but could not protect themselves against it. The deputies' ballad included verses that described their attempts at protection, the talismans they carried, the precautions they took, the prayers they offered to a God who seemed not to be listening. The futility of these efforts was emphasized by the relentless progression of the deaths, each verse ending with another name added to the list of the fallen, another colleague buried in ground that seemed to be hungry for more. A fourth song addressed the ethical questions that the case raised, examining whether poison was a legitimate weapon for those who could not employ violence directly, whether Granny Blackwater's methods were justified by the limitations that her age imposed. whether the betrayal of trust that her campaign required was excusable given the provocation she had received. This song offered no answers, only questions that listeners were invited to consider. The ethical ballad was structured as a dialogue between two voices, one defending Granny Blackwater's actions and one condemning them. The voices alternated throughout the song, each presenting arguments that the other could not entirely refute, the debate remaining unresolved when the final verse ended. Musicians who performed this song reported that it often sparked discussions among audience members that continued long after the performance was over. A fifth song focused on the healer's knowledge itself, describing the plants and preparations that Granny Blackwater might have used, the thin line between medicine and poison that every healer walked, the power that such knowledge conferred on those who possessed it. This song had an almost educational quality, its verses cataloguing the herbs that could heal and the herbs that could kill, often the same plant in different doses or preparations. A sixth song told the story from Vernon Crawford's perspective, the political boss whose persecution of Granny Blackwater had started the chain of events that killed 22 of his men. This song portrayed Crawford as a man who had overreached, whose arrogance had led him to attack someone he should have left alone, whose victory over an old woman and her grandson had transformed into a defeat that he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand. The historians who have studied the Granny Blackwater case have reached varying conclusions about its significance and meaning. Some have analyzed it as an example of resistance to corrupt authority, arguing that her campaign represented a response to abuses that the legal system not only failed to prevent, but actively committed. The humiliation of Thomas Blackwater was not a crime under the law as it existed, but was a moral outrage that demanded response. Others have focused on the gender dynamics of the case, noting that Granny Blackwater's success depended partly on the assumptions that her age and sex created. The investigators who questioned her could not believe that an elderly woman was capable of the violence she had committed, could not imagine that someone who looked like a grandmother could think and act like an assassin. Her appearance provided cover that a male avenger would not have enjoyed. The medical analysis has examined her methods, noting that the substances she employed would have required sophisticated knowledge of pharmacology and toxicology that most physicians of the era did not possess. Her campaign demonstrated that traditional healing knowledge, passed down through generations of practitioners, could include information that formal medical education did not provide. The substances she used have never been definitively identified, but historians have speculated about various plant-based toxins that would have produced the symptoms the victims displayed. The forensic analysis has attempted to reconstruct which specific plants and preparations Granny Blackwater might have employed. The symptoms described in the available records suggest a variety of cardiac glycosides, alkaloids, and other naturally occurring toxins that would have been available in the Kentucky mountains. The fact that no two deaths presented identical symptoms suggests that she varied her methods deliberately, preventing any pattern from emerging that might have allowed investigators to identify her techniques. The psychological analysis has examined the impact of the campaign on Granny Blackwater herself, noting that killing 22 people over 18 months would have required a sustained emotional effort that most people could not have maintained. Her ability to continue her healing work while simultaneously planning and executing murders suggested a capacity for compartmentalization that psychologists find remarkable. The same hands that prepared remedies to save lives also prepared poisons to take them, a duality that most human beings could not have sustained. The sociological analysis has examined the community's role in enabling the campaign, noting that Granny Blackwater could not have succeeded without the access that her position as healer provided. The community that invited her into their homes and trusted her remedies was unwittingly facilitating the deaths of the deputies who had humiliated Thomas. Whether this facilitation was entirely unwitting, or whether some members of the community understood what was happening and chose not to interfere, remains a subject of debate. The economic analysis has noted the class dynamics that shaped the case. Vernon Crawford was wealthy and powerful, Thomas Blackwater was poor and vulnerable. The deputies were working-class men whose service to Crawford was purchased with wages they desperately needed. The campaign can be understood partly as a response to class-based persecution, a demonstration that even the poorest and oldest members of society could strike back against those who abused their power. The religious analysis has examined the role of faith in shaping both the community's response to Thomas's humiliation and its acceptance of Granny Blackwater's vengeance. The mountain communities were deeply religious, their Christianity emphasizing justice and retribution alongside mercy and forgiveness. The community's apparent acceptance of the deaths suggested a belief that divine justice was being administered through human hands, that God was using Granny Blackwater as an instrument of punishment. The legal analysis has examined the failure to prosecute, noting that the case exposed fundamental challenges in investigating deaths by poison. The substances Granny Blackwater employed left no traces that the forensic methods of the era could detect. The chain of causation was too indirect to prove. The evidence was too circumstantial to support conviction. Her campaign demonstrated that certain types of killing were effectively unprosecutable, a fact that legal reformers found deeply troubling. You see, what Granny Blackwater did cannot be justified by any conventional legal or moral framework. She killed 22 men through poison, betraying the trust that her position as healer had established, using knowledge that was supposed to serve life to inflict death instead. The fact that her victims had participated in her grandson's humiliation does not eliminate the fact that she took 22 human lives in response to what was, legally, not even a crime. And yet her story cannot be simply condemned, reduced to a tale of murder that teaches only the obvious lesson that killing is wrong. Her grandson had been chained like a dog in the town square, had been forced to lap water from a bowl while deputies laughed, had been degraded for 3 days while the community watched and his grandmother stood helpless at the edge of the crowd. The men who did this to him wore badges and acted under color of law, were protected by a system that would never hold them accountable, would have faced no consequences for what they did if Granny Blackwater had not created consequences herself. The story challenges us to consider the relationship between law and justice, between official authority and moral right. The deputies who humiliated Thomas were acting within the law as it existed, were exercising powers that the legal system had conferred upon them, were doing exactly what men in their position were supposed to do. Granny Blackwater's response was illegal by any standard, a campaign of murder that no court would have authorized and that no legal theory could justify. And yet, her response addressed a wrong that the law would never have addressed, provided justice that the legal system would never have provided. The question of whether her methods were acceptable is more complex than the question of whether her cause was just. She could not have defeated the deputies through violence, could not have challenged them with weapons they would have turned against her. Poison was the only method available to a 73-year-old woman who wanted to kill men in their prime. But poison carries connotations of treachery and cowardice that direct violence does not, requires a betrayal of trust that other methods of killing do not demand. Her use of her healing knowledge to kill rather than cure was a perversion of everything that her life's work had represented. The descendants of those who knew Granny Blackwater still live in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, carrying memories passed down through generations about what she did and why. Family stories speak of the old woman with a mixture of admiration and unease, recognizing both the justice of her cause and the horror of her methods. She is remembered as proof that the weak can defeat the strong when they have sufficient knowledge and sufficient determination, but also as a warning about what happens when the bonds of trust that hold communities together are broken. The grave where Granny Blackwater rests is still maintained, still visited by those who know her story, still marked by the stone that gives no hint of the vengeance she took. Visitors who know the history sometimes leave small offerings, herbs and flowers that reflect her legacy as a healer, tokens of respect for a woman whose life contained multitudes that no single description can capture. The cabin where she lived and practiced her craft has long since fallen into ruin, the logs returning to the earth from which they came, the garden where she grew her herbs reverting to forest. But the location is still known to some in the community, still pointed out to those who ask about the old woman who killed 22 lawmen through methods that no one could prove and that no one could stop. The place carries a weight that visitors report feeling, a sense of history that lingers in certain locations where significant events have occurred. The story of Granny Blackwater endures because it speaks to something fundamental in the human experience. It is the story of love between generations, of a grandmother's determination to protect and avenge the grandson who was all she had left in the world. It is the story of power and its limits, of an elderly woman who proved that badges and guns are not the only forms of power. That knowledge can be as deadly as any weapon. It is the story of justice and its costs, of what happens when the systems that are supposed to protect the innocent instead become instruments of their persecution. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand at Granny Blackwater's grave, to read the stone that gives no hint of her vengeance, to contemplate the life of a woman who healed and killed with equal skill? Would you seek out the ruins of her cabin? Would you walk through the woods where she gathered the herbs that served both purposes? Would you try to understand how a healer becomes an avenger, and what that transformation costs? The journey to Breathitt County is easier now than it was in 1889. The roads paved and the towns connected to the wider world in ways that Granny Blackwater could not have imagined. But the mountains remain, ancient and patient, holding their memories close like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows. The graves of the healers and the killers rest in those mountains, sometimes the same person occupying both roles, their stories intertwined in ways that refuse to be untangled. The mountains keep their secrets, but not this one. The story of Granny Blackwater has been told and retold through generations, passed from parent to child, sung in ballads that still bring shivers to those who hear them. It is a story about what happens when the law becomes the criminal, when those who are supposed to protect instead persecute, when an old woman decides that the humiliation of her grandson must be answered regardless of the cost. It is a story that forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about justice and mercy, about the limits of forgiveness, about what we would do if someone we loved was chained like a dog in the public square. And that, my friend, is the true story of Granny Blackwater, who slaughtered 22 lawmen after they chained her grandson like a dog in the town square, each victim dying of causes that appeared natural but that were anything but. The campaign lasting 18 months and ending on the anniversary of Thomas's humiliation, the methods never proven and the perpetrator never prosecuted. A story of a grandmother's love and a grandmother's fury, of healing knowledge turned to deadly purpose, of an elderly woman who proved that age is no barrier to vengeance when the cause is just and the determination is absolute. The mountains remember, and through them so do we all.